The airport buzzed like a living thing, chaotic, restless, alive. Travelers darted through the terminal, dragging suitcases that clattered over the tiles, their voices blending into a dull roar pierced by the occasional crackle of a gate announcement. Amid the flurry, one woman stood apart, untouched by the haste. Margaret Maggie Hensley, 74 years old, moved with the kind of quiet grace that didn't demand attention but commanded it all the same. Her silver hair gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, swept back in a loose bun that spoke of elegance earned through decades. She wore a soft gray cashmere sweater, its simplicity offset by the shimmer of a pearl necklace draped across her collarbone, a family heirloom, delicate and timeless, a gift from her husband on their 50th anniversary. In her left hand she carried a sleek leather tote, and in her right, a boarding pass that felt heavier than it looked. Maggie reached the first-class boarding lane, her steps unhurried. The gate agent, a young man with a nervous smile, scanned her ticket and froze for a split second, as if the name on it carried a weight he couldn't quite place. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Hensley," he said, his voice a touch too eager. "Enjoy your flight." She gave him a small, knowing-nod politeness wrapped in steel and made her way down the jet bridge, the faint click of her low heels echoing in the tunnel. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of crisp leather and expensive cologne. First-class passengers were already settling in, some adjusting their cashmere blankets, others sipping pre-flight champagne with practiced nonchalance. Maggie glided to seat 1A, a prime spot by the window, and set her tote down with care. She smoothed her sweater, her fingers brushing the pearls as if to reassure herself they were still there, then sank into the plush seat. Outside, the tarmac shimmered under the afternoon sun, planes taxiing like obedient beasts. She wasn't here to rush. She'd flown too many times to be rattled by the chaos of travel. But then a shadow fell across her. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was sharp, clipped, and carried an edge of authority that demanded obedience. Maggie turned her head slowly, her hazel eyes meeting the figure looming over her. Vanessa Ness Drummond, 35 years old, stood tall and impeccable in her flight attendant uniform, navy blazer pressed to perfection, blonde hair pulled into a tight, flawless ponytail. She was striking, the kind of woman who turned heads not just with her looks but with the confidence she wore like a second skin. Her lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes, which flickered with something between irritation and disdain. Maggie tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she replied, her voice soft but steady, the kind that made you lean in to listen. Vanessa's gaze darted to the boarding pass still in Maggie's hand, then back to her face. "This is first class," she said, her tone slow and deliberate, as if explaining something to a child. She crossed her arms, her polished nails tapping lightly against her sleeve. "I'm just making sure you're in the right place." Maggie's lips twitched, the faintest hint of amusement crossing her face. She held out her boarding pass without a word, her movements calm, almost leisurely. Vanessa snatched it, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the details. The name matched. The seat matched. Everything was in order. Yet her jaw tightened, and she handed it back with a smile so forced it looked like it hurt. "Just checking," she muttered, her voice dripping with skepticism. Maggie nodded once, settling back into her seat. She'd seen this before, people looking at her and deciding she didn't belong, their assumptions painting her as less than she was. She adjusted the pearls around her neck, their cool weight a quiet reminder of who she really was, and turned her gaze back to the window. The plane hummed beneath her, readying for takeoff, and for a moment all was still. But Vanessa didn't walk away. She lingered, her shadow stretching across Maggie's lap like a storm cloud waiting to break. And in that moment, something shifted in the air, a tension so subtle yet so electric it prickled the skin. Maggie didn't know it yet, but the woman standing over her was about to make a choice that would unravel everything. And Vanessa? She had no idea that the quiet, unassuming passenger in seat 1A was the spark that would set her world ablaze. The hum of the plane's engines vibrated through the cabin, a low growl that promised motion but hadn't yet delivered it. First-class passengers settled deeper into their seats, the clink of champagne glasses and rustle of newspapers filling the space with a false sense of calm. Maggie Hensley sat still, her gaze fixed on the window where the tarmac stretched out like a gray sea under the sun's glare. The pearl necklace rested cool against her skin, each bead a tiny anchor tying her to decades of memory. She was content to wait, to let the flight unfold as it always did until Vanessa Drummond decided otherwise. "Ma'am." Vanessa's voice cut through the quiet again, sharper this time, laced with an impatience she didn't bother to hide. Maggie turned her head, meeting those cold blue eyes once more. Vanessa stood closer now, her posture rigid, arms crossed tight enough to crease her pristine blazer. "I need you to move." Maggie raised an eyebrow, her expression unshaken. "Move," she echoed, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made the word feel like a challenge. Vanessa's lips twitched, a flicker of irritation breaking through her polished facade. "Yes, move," she snapped, glancing around as if expecting the other passengers to back her up. "There's been a mix-up. This seat," she jabbed a finger toward one, "isn't yours. I don't care what your ticket says." The cabin grew quieter, the kind of silence that creeps in when people sense trouble brewing. A man in a pinstripe suit across the aisle lowered his newspaper, his eyes darting between the two women. A woman sipping champagne froze mid-motion, the glass hovering near her lips. Maggie took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the pearls as she straightened in her seat. "My ticket says 1A, she said, calm as still water. "If there's a problem, I'd like to hear it from the captain." Vanessa's jaw clenched so hard a vein pulsed in her neck. She wasn't used to this passenger's talking back, especially not one she'd already sized up as out of place. "Look, lady," she said, her voice dropping into a hiss. "This isn't some discount shuttle. First class is for a certain type of person, and I'm sorry but you." She stopped, catching herself, but the damage was done. The insult hung in the air, raw and ugly. Maggie's eyes narrowed just a fraction, but it was enough to send a chill through anyone paying attention. "And what type am I?" she asked, her tone so steady it felt like a blade sliding into place. Vanessa faltered, her confidence cracking for a heartbeat. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "I just meant," she started, but Maggie raised a hand, cutting her off with a gesture so subtle it was almost invisible. "If you have a real issue," Maggie said, "get someone who can explain it. Otherwise, I'm staying right here." The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa's face flushed red, her breath coming faster as the weight of Maggie's defiance sank in. She wasn't just being questioned, she was being dismissed, in front of everyone. A younger flight attendant, Clara, peeked out from the galley, her wide eyes darting between the two women. "Ness, maybe we should," she began, but Vanessa whipped around, her glare silencing Clara mid-sentence. "Stay out of this," Vanessa barked, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. She turned back to Maggie, leaning in too close. "I said move. Now." Maggie didn't flinch. She met Vanessa's stare, her hazel eyes unflinching, and said nothing. That silence was a match to gasoline. Vanessa's hand shot out, grabbing the sleeve of Maggie's sweater. "Fine if you won't listen," she snarled, yanking hard. Maggie's body jerked forward, her balance lost, and she tumbled out of the seat, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The pearl necklace snapped under the strain, the delicate string breaking apart. Tiny white beads scattered across the carpeted aisle, rolling like tears in every direction, their soft clatter echoing louder than a scream. A gasp ripped through the cabin. The man in the pinstripe suit bolted upright, his newspaper crumpling in his lap. "What the hell?" he shouted, his voice breaking the spell of shock. The woman with the champagne dropped her glass, the crystal shattering against the tray table. Clara clapped a hand over her mouth, her face paling as she stared at the scene unfolding before her. Maggie stayed down for a moment, one hand braced against the floor, the other clutching at her now bare neck where the necklace had been. A single pearl rolled to a stop near her fingers, glinting under the cabin lights. She didn't cry out, didn't curse. She just looked up at Vanessa, and the look in her eyes wasn't anger, it was something far worse. It was certainty. Vanessa froze, her hand still outstretched, her breath catching as the reality of what she'd done crashed over her. The cabin erupted into chaos, passengers whispering, some fumbling for their phones, others shouting for the crew. "She pushed her," a woman near the back cried. "Get the captain," another demanded. Clara stumbled forward, her voice shaking. "Ness, you can't adjust." But Vanessa wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on Maggie, who slowly pushed herself up, brushing off her sweater with a dignity that made the air feel heavier. The older woman reached down, picking up that lone pearl and closing it in her fist. Then, with a calmness that cut deeper than any shout, she pulled her phone from her tote, typed a single message and pressed send. Vanessa's stomach dropped. She didn't know who that message was for, didn't know what it said. But as Maggie folded her hands in her lap and turned back to the window, ignoring the chaos around her, Vanessa felt a cold dread slither up her spine. She just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. And in the stillness of that moment, with the pearls still scattered like evidence across the floor, the storm she'd unleashed was already gathering strength. The cabin was a live wire, crackling with tension and disbelief. The scattered pearls glinted on the floor like tiny accusations, each one a silent witness to Vanessa Drummond's unraveling. Maggie Hensley sat back in her seat now, her posture as composed as if she'd never been touched, though the faint red mark on her arm told a different story. She held that single pearl in her hand, rolling it between her fingers, her face a mask of calm that made the chaos around her feel louder. Passengers buzzed like hornets, some recording with trembling hands, others shouting over each other, their voices a jumbled mess of outrage and shock. "She pushed her down," a woman in a floral scarf yelled, waving her phone like a flag. "This is insane, someone get the captain," a man in row 3 barked, half standing from his seat. Vanessa stood frozen in the aisle, her breath shallow, her outstretched hand still hovering where it had yanked Maggie's sleeve. Her mind raced, scrambling for an escape, but her body wouldn't move. The weight of every eye in the cabin bore down on her, stripping away the authority she'd worn like armor. Clara, the younger flight attendant, stumbled toward her, her voice a panicked whisper. "Ness, what did you do? You can't just—" But Vanessa didn't hear her. Her ears rang with the echo of those pearls hitting the floor, a sound that wouldn't stop replaying in her head. Maggie didn't look at her. She didn't need to. She slipped her phone onto the armrest, the screen still glowing faintly from the message she'd sent, and folded her hands in her lap. That quiet act, simple, deliberate, felt like a guillotine blade hanging over Vanessa's neck. And then the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain." A voice began, steady but clipped, only to be cut off by a deeper, colder tone that sliced through the static like a knife. "Enough of that, Pierce. This is Edward Hensley." The name hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Passengers froze mid-sentence, their phones still raised but their mouths falling silent. Vanessa's stomach lurched, her knees buckling slightly as she gripped the edge of a seat to steady herself. Edward Hensley. Not just a name, but the name, the man who owned this airline, whose signature was on every plane, every uniform, every paycheck. Her paycheck. "Vanessa Drummond," Edward's voice continued, slow and deliberate, each syllable dripping with menace. "You just put your hands on my wife. You have 30 seconds to explain before I come down there myself." The air turned to ice. Vanessa's throat closed up, her pulse hammering so hard she thought her chest might split open. She fumbled for the intercom button near the galley, her fingers slick with sweat as she pressed it. "Mr. Hensley, sir," she stammered, her voice cracking. It was a misunderstanding. I thought there was a seating error," and she stopped, realizing how weak it sounded, how hollow. The truth was clawing its way up her throat, but she couldn't let it out, not yet. A long pause stretched over the cabin, heavy and suffocating. Then Edward spoke again, his tone so calm it was terrifying. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "You pushed Margaret Hensley out of her seat. You broke her necklace, a gift I gave her 50 years ago. And you call that a misunderstanding?" Vanessa's blood ran cold. The necklace. She hadn't even thought about it, hadn't registered its worth beyond the sound of it snapping. Her eyes darted to the floor, where the pearls still lay scattered, and then to Maggie, who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't even glanced her way. The older woman's silence was louder than any accusation, sharper than any scream. "Two didn't mean to," Vanessa blurted into the intercom, her voice rising with desperation. "She wouldn't listen, and I lost my temper. I'm sorry. Enough." Edward's command was final, a door slamming shut. The intercom crackled again, and this time it was the captain's voice, firm and unyielding. "Miss Drummond, this is Captain Pierce. You are relieved of duty effective immediately. Step away from the passengers and report to the galley. Now." Vanessa's hand dropped from the intercom, her arm limp at her side. The cabin spun around her, faces blurring, whispers growing into a roar. Clara grabbed her elbow, tugging her toward the galley. Ness, come on, you have to move, she hissed, her eyes wide with fear. But Vanessa barely felt it. Her legs moved on autopilot, dragging her past the staring passengers, past the man in the pinstripe suit who muttered, "She's done for," past the woman with the broken champagne glass who smirked behind her hand. As she reached the galley, the intercom buzzed one last time. Edward's voice returned, low and lethal. "And Vanessa," he said, pausing just long enough to let the dread sink in, "you'll answer for this when we land. Enjoy the time you have left." The line went dead. Clara let go of her arm, stepping back as if Vanessa were contagious. The galley's narrow walls closed in, the hum of the engines now a deafening roar in her ears. Vanessa's hands shook as she gripped the counter, her mind reeling. She'd heard the stories Edward Hensley didn't just fire people, he destroyed them. And Maggie hadn't said a word, hadn't needed to. That single text had been enough. Outside in the cabin, passengers whispered and pointed, their phones still recording, capturing every second of her downfall. The pearls on the floor gleamed like a trail of evidence, leading straight to her ruin. Vanessa's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain. She just ignited a fire she couldn't put out. And Edward Hensley was already fanning the flames. The galley was a cage, cramped, sterile, and suffocating. Vanessa Drummond leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge so hard her knuckles turned white. The hum of the engines pulsed through the floor, a relentless reminder that the plane was still hers for now. But that illusion shattered with every whisper filtering in from the cabin, every muffled laugh and pointed stare she could feel through the thin partition. Her uniform, once a badge of power, clung to her like a lie, the navy fabric damp with sweat. Clara hovered nearby, her nervous energy crackling in the tight space. "Ness, you need to sit down," she muttered, glancing toward the curtain separating them from the passengers. "This is bad." Vanessa didn't respond. Her ears still rang with Edward Hensley's voice, low, lethal, promising ruin. "Enjoy the time you have left." The words looped in her mind, each repetition tightening the knot in her chest. She'd always been the one in control, directing passengers, enforcing rules, commanding respect. Now she was nothing, a ghost haunting her own flight, stripped of authority before the wheels had even left the ground. The curtain rustled and Captain Pierce stepped through, his gray-streaked hair catching the dim galley light. He was a man of few words, his presence alone enough to silence a room, but today his face was carved with something darker, disapproval, maybe even disgust. Vanessa straightened instinctively, clinging to the last scraps of her dignity. "Captain, I can explain," she started, her voice hoarse. Pierce held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," he said, his tone flat but sharp enough to draw blood. "You've done enough." He adjusted his cap, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her shrink. "You're off duty, Drummond. Effective now. Get your things and move to the jump seat in the back." Vanessa's breath caught. The jump seat, the humiliating perch reserved for trainees or crew in disgrace. Her face burned, a flush creeping up her neck. "Captain, please," she said, stepping forward, her hands trembling. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean." "A mistake." Pierce's voice rose just enough to make her flinch. "You assaulted a passenger, Drummond. You pushed Mrs. Hensley, Edward Hensley's wife, out of her seat, and broke something that matters more to him than this entire damn airline." He shook his head, rubbing his temple as if her stupidity gave him a headache. "You don't get to call that a mistake." The galley curtain twitched again, and Clara peeked out at the cabin, her face paling. "They're still recording," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the engines. "Everyone's watching." Vanessa's stomach twisted. She could picture the phones raised, the lenses trained on her shame, capturing every second for the world to dissect. She'd seen passengers humiliated before, had even been the one to do it, kicking off drunks, scolding rule breakers, but never this. Never her. Pierce stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Mr. Hensley's orders are clear. You're to walk back through that cabin, past every passenger you just gave a front row seat to your little meltdown, and sit in the back until we land. And if you so much as look at Mrs. Hensley again, I'll have the air marshal cuff you right here." He paused, letting that sink in. "Understood." Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. There was no arguing with Pierce, no pleading with a man who just heard Edward Hensley's voice cut through his cockpit like a blade. She nodded a jerky, mechanical motion and reached for her bag with shaking hands. The weight of it felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else, someone who still had a career, a future. Pierce didn't wait for her. He turned and pushed through the curtain, his silhouette disappearing into the cabin's hum. Clara hesitated, then followed, leaving Vanessa alone in the galley's cold silence. She took a ragged breath, steeling herself, and stepped out. The walk was a gauntlet. The moment she emerged, the whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy, expectant hush. Every head turned, some with pity, some with scorn, others with outright glee. The man in the pinstripe suit leaned into the aisle, his phone angled to catch her every move. The woman with the broken champagne glass smirked, muttering something to her seatmate that made them both laugh. Vanessa kept her eyes forward, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. But she couldn't block it out, the stares, the murmurs, the soft click of cameras immortalizing her disgrace. And then she saw her Maggie Hensley, still in seat 1A, her silver hair catching the light like a crown. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the spectacle Vanessa had become. She sat with her hands folded, that lone pearl resting on the armrest beside her phone, a quiet monument to Vanessa's ruin. The sight of it calm, the indifference hit harder than any shout. Vanessa's steps faltered, her chest tightening with a mix of rage and dread, but Pierce's warning echoed in her ears. She forced herself to keep moving, past the pearls still scattered on the floor, past the evidence of her own undoing. When she reached the jump seat at the back, she sank into it, her bag thudding to the floor. The engines roared louder now, the plane taxiing toward takeoff, but all she could hear was the blood pounding in her ears. She'd been banished publicly, irreversible before the flight had even begun. And as the cabin lights dimmed for departure, she felt the first real stab of fear. Edward Hensley's voice hadn't just stripped her of her duties, it had promised something worse. Something was waiting for her when they landed, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be quiet. Out in the cabin, Maggie turned her head slightly, her hazel eyes catching the last glimpse of Vanessa's retreating figure. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply picked up the pearl, closed it in her fist, and looked out the window as the plane lifted off, carrying them all toward a reckoning no one could escape. The plane sliced through the sky, its engines a steady roar that drowned out everything but the chaos in Vanessa Drummond's head. She sat hunched in the jump seat at the back, her navy blazer wrinkled now, her once perfect ponytail fraying at the edges. The cabin lights were dim, casting long shadows that stretched toward her like fingers of judgment. Her bag lay at her feet, untouched, a useless relic of a life that was slipping away with every mile they climbed. The whispers from first class had faded into the hum of flight, but she could still feel them, the stares, the phones, the weight of her own disgrace pressing down until she could hardly breathe. She'd never felt so small. For years she'd ruled these cabins, her word law. Her presence a force passengers couldn't ignore. Now she was nothing, a shadow relegated to the back, stripped of power before the plane had even taken off. Edward Hensley's voice echoed in her skull. Enjoy the time you have left, a promise of something worse than this humiliation, something final. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let it end like this. She wouldn't. Clara emerged from the galley, her face a mix of pity and unease. She carried a tray of water cups, her movements mechanical, but her eyes kept darting to Vanessa. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low, as if afraid the passengers might hear. Vanessa let out a bitter laugh, sharp and hollow. "Do I look okay?" She rubbed her face, her fingers trembling. "I'm not done yet, Clara. I can fix this." Clara frowned, setting the tray down. "Fix it? Ness, you heard Mr. Hensley. You heard the captain. This isn't something you talk your way out of." "Maybe not with them," Vanessa said, her voice hardening with a desperate edge. She stood, smoothing her blazer as if it could restore some shred of her old self. "But her Mrs. Hensley's the one I hurt. If I can make her listen, if I can apologize," she trailed off, clinging to the fragile hope that Maggie might soften, might intervene, might stop the storm her husband was unleashing. Clara's eyes widened. "You can't go back out there," Pierce said. "I don't care what Pierce said," Vanessa snapped, her fear twisting into defiance. "I'm not sitting here waiting for them to bury me when we land. I'm taking this chance. Before Clara could protest, she pushed past her, stepping out of the galley's shadows and into the dim light of the cabin. The walk back to first class felt longer this time, each step heavier than the last. The passengers noticed her immediately, heads turning, whispers reigniting like embers catching flame. The man in the pinstripe suit smirked, nudging his seatmate. The woman with the broken champagne glass raised an eyebrow, her phone slipping into her lap as if ready to record again. Vanessa kept her head high, her jaw set, but inside she was unraveling, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She stopped beside seat 1A. Maggie Hensley sat there, unchanged, silver hair gleaming, hands folded, that single pearl resting on the armrest like a silent sentinel. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Vanessa's presence. The older woman's calm was a wall, impenetrable and infuriating. Vanessa swallowed, her throat dry as sand, and forced the words out. "Mrs. Hensley," she said, her voice softer than it had ever been, "two need to speak with you." Maggie's head turned slightly, just enough to meet Vanessa's gaze. Her hazel eyes were steady, unreadable, cutting through the flight attendant like a blade through silk. She said nothing, waiting, and that silence was worse than any rebuke. Vanessa's hands twitched at her sides, but she pressed on, desperation clawing at her chest. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "What I did pushing you, the necklacite, was wrong. I wasn't thinking. I was out of line, and I regret it more than you can know." The cabin held its breath. A few passengers leaned closer, their curiosity naked now. Maggie tilted her head, studying Vanessa as if she were a puzzle with missing pieces. Then in a voice so soft it barely carried, she spoke. "Sorry," she repeated, tasting the word. "Are you?" Vanessa nodded quickly, seizing the opening. "Yes, I am. I should have respected you, your seat, everything. I was stupid, and I'm begging you to forgive me. Please, if you could just tell Mr. Hensley." "Forgiveness," Maggie cut in, her tone sharpening just enough to stop Vanessa cold, "doesn't erase what's done." She leaned back in her seat, her fingers brushing the pearl as if it held all the answers Vanessa sought. "You didn't just push me, Miss Drummond. You broke something that can't be fixed with words. And you did it because you thought I didn't belong here." Her eyes flicked over Vanessa, cool and piercing. "Tell me, are you sorry because you mean it? Or because you're afraid?" Vanessa's breath hitched. The question was a trap, and she knew it. She could lie, could paint herself as repentant, but those eyes, Maggie's eyes, saw through her like glass. She stammered, then forced the truth out, raw and unsteady. "I'm sorry because I was wrong. I judged you, and I shouldn't have. I panicked and too I'm scared, yes, but I know I messed up. Please give me a chance to make it right." Maggie's expression didn't shift. She let the silence stretch, a chasm Vanessa couldn't cross. Then she sighed, a sound so faint it was almost lost in the engine's hum. "I believe you're scared," she said, her voice calm but final. "But I don't believe you've learned." She picked up the pearl, holding it up between them like a verdict. "You think an apology fixes this?" She nodded toward the floor, where the other pearls still lay scattered. "You think it fixes me?" Vanessa's hope crumbled, her knees weakening. "I'll do anything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Anything you ask." Maggie's gaze hardened just for a moment, then softened into something almost pitying. "It's not me you need to convince," she said, slipping the pearl into her tote and pulling out her phone. She tapped the screen once, then slid it away. "I've already said what I needed to." She turned back to the window, dismissing Vanessa as completely as if she'd vanished. The rejection landed like a punch. Vanessa stood there, trembling, the cabin's eyes burning into her back. The man in the pinstripe suit chuckled softly, a sound that grated against her nerves. She turned, her vision blurring, and stumbled back toward the jump seat, the whispers chasing her like a pack of wolves. She'd bared her soul, swallowed her pride, and it hadn't mattered. Maggie didn't care. And Edward? Edward was waiting. As she sank into the jump seat, her hands covering her face, she realized the truth. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about consequences. And whatever was coming when they landed, she'd face it alone. The plane's descent was smooth, a gentle tilt toward the earth that belied the storm raging inside Vanessa Drummond. She sat rigid in the jump seat, her hands clasped so tightly her nails left crescent marks in her skin. The cabin lights brightened as the landing gear whirred beneath them, But for her, the world was a blur of shadows and dread. Maggie Hensley's words, "It's not me you need to convince," looped in her mind, a cruel refrain that drowned out the captain's final announcement. She'd begged, she'd pleaded, and it had meant nothing. Now, with every second bringing them closer to the ground, she felt the noose of her own making tightening around her neck. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, rolling toward the gate as a smattering of applause broke out, an old habit among passengers, meaningless today. Vanessa barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her breath shallow, as if she could delay the inevitable by refusing to look up. Clara moved past her, prepping the cabin for deplaning, but she didn't speak, didn't meet Vanessa's gaze. The silence between them was louder than any words. Then came the ding of the seatbelt sign shutting off, and the cabin erupted into motion, passengers standing, stretching, gathering their bags with the restless energy of people eager to escape. Vanessa didn't move. She couldn't. Not until the door hissed open, and a wave of cold air swept in from the jet bridge, carrying with it a sound that made her blood freeze. The murmur of voices, sharp and official, waiting just beyond the threshold. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaky, and peeked through the galley curtain. There, framed in the doorway, stood Edward Hensley. He was taller than she'd imagined, his gray suit impeccable, his silver hair catching the light like a crown of steel. His face was unreadable, a mask of calm that hid something dangerous beneath. Flanking him were two airline executives in crisp navy blazers, their expressions stiff and procedural, and God help her, two uniformed security officers, their hands resting lightly on their belts. But what made her stomach drop, what sent her heart into freefall, was the large screen they'd set up just outside the plane. It flickered to life as she watched, and there it was, the video. The footage played in brutal clarity, her grabbing Maggie's sleeve, the yank, the fall, the pearls scattering like gunfire across the floor. The sound was tinny but unmistakable, amplified for everyone to hear. Passengers in the cabin turned, their chatter dying as they caught sight of the screen. A collective gasp rippled through first class, followed by whispers that grew into a roar. "That's her," the woman with the broken champagne glass hissed, pointing. The man in the pinstripe suit let out a low whistle, his smirk widening. Vanessa shrank back, her breath catching, but there was nowhere to hide. Edward stepped forward, his presence filling the doorway like a judge ascending the bench. His eyes found her instantly, locking onto her with a precision that made her feel like prey. "Miss Drummond," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the crowd, smooth and unshaken. "Step forward." Her legs moved before her mind could catch up, dragging her through the cabin toward the front. The passengers parted like a sea, their stares boring into her, some curious, some gleeful, others cold with judgment. She reached the doorway, her hands trembling at her sides, and stopped a few feet from Edward. Up close, he was even more imposing, his gaze a blade that cut through her last defenses. "Mr. Hensley," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He raised a hand, silencing her. "I don't want your excuses," he said, his tone so even it was chilling. "I want you to look at that." He nodded toward the screen, where the video looped again, Maggie hitting the floor, the pearls rolling, Vanessa's frozen shock playing out in endless repetition. "You did that. You thought you had the right." Vanessa's throat closed up. She couldn't look away, couldn't escape the image of herself, arrogant, reckless, undone. "I'm sorry," she choked out, tears stinging her eyes. "I didn't know." "You didn't care," Edward cut in, his voice sharpening. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "You saw my wife and decided she didn't belong. You broke something priceless, 50 years of our lives, because you couldn't stand being wrong." He paused, letting the words sink in, then turned to the executive beside him. "Effective immediately, Vanessa Drummond is terminated from this airline. Her contract is void, her record flagged. She's done." The executive nodded, tapping something into a tablet, but Vanessa barely heard it. The world tilted, her vision blurring as the weight of his words crushed her. "Wait," she gasped, stepping forward. "Please, Mr. Hensley, I'll do anything." "Anything." Edward's lips curved, a flicker of amusement that wasn't kind. "You had your chance, Miss Drummond. The moment you laid hands on Maggie, you lost it." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a murmur only she could hear. "You thought you had power over her. Now you have none. Her knees buckled, but before she could collapse, one of the security officers stepped forward, his hand firm on her arm. "This way," he said, his tone clipped professional. The other officer moved to her opposite side, boxing her in. Passengers openly stared now, some lifting their phones again. The soft clicks of cameras a chorus of her downfall. Edward turned away, his attention shifting as Maggie appeared at the doorway. She stepped down with that same quiet grace, her sweater smooth, her hand clutching the lone pearl. She didn't look at Vanessa, didn't need to. "Edward," she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Let's go." He nodded, offering her his arm, but not before casting one last glance at Vanessa, look that promised this wasn't the end, only the beginning of her reckoning. The security officers tugged her forward, and as she stumbled onto the jet bridge, the screen looped the video again, the sound of those pearls hitting the floor echoing in her ears like a death knell. The cabin erupted into chatter as she disappeared from view, some passengers laughing, others shaking their heads. "She's finished," the man in the pinstripe suit said, loud enough for everyone to hear. And as Vanessa was led away, flanked by security, the weight of her mistake crashed down fully. Edward Hensley hadn't just fired her. He'd made her an example, and the world was watching. The jet bridge stretched ahead like a tunnel to nowhere, its sterile walls closing in as Vanessa Drummond was escorted away from the plane. The security officers flanked her, their steps measured and unrelenting, their grips firm but not harsh, just enough to remind her she had no choice. Her blazer hung loose now, the navy fabric creased and damp, a far cry from the crisp authority it once projected. Her ponytail had unraveled completely, blonde strands sticking to her sweat-slicked neck. Behind her, the hum of the cabin faded, replaced by the distant buzz of the terminal life moving on without her. They emerged into the airport, and the shift was immediate. Passengers milled about, oblivious at first, their suitcases rattling over the tiles, their voices a chaotic symphony of arrivals and departures. But then they saw her, the disheveled flight attendant, the security escort, the unmistakable air of disgrace, and the whispers started. A woman in a red coat nudged her husband, pointing. A teenage boy lifted his phone, snapping a photo with a grin. Vanessa kept her head down, her face burning, but she couldn't block it out, the stares, the murmurs, the realization spreading like wildfire that she was the story now. The officers led her to a side corridor, away from the public gates, where a woman in a navy suit waited. Her name tag read Rebecca Klein, Senior Flight Operations Manager, and her expression was as cold as the tablet she held. "Miss Drummond," she said, her voice clipped and professional, "we're completing your termination process. Follow me." Vanessa's stomach twisted, but she nodded, her legs moving on autopilot. The corridor led to an elevator, its doors sliding open with a soft ding that felt like a gavel striking. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Rebecca swiped her badge, and the elevator jolted upward, carrying them to a restricted floor. Vanessa forced herself to speak, her voice a rasp. "Miss Klein, I know I messed up, but isn't there some kind of review? A chance to?" Rebecca's sharp glance cut her off. "This isn't a negotiation," she said, her tone flat. "You assaulted a passenger, Margaret Hensley, no less. There's no review, no appeal. It's done." She tapped her tablet, pulling up a document that made Vanessa's heart stop. Her termination letter, already signed, already official. "You're permanently banned from this airline, and your employment record is flagged. Per Mr. Hensley's directive, that flag extends to our parent company and its affiliates, over 40 carriers worldwide." The words hit like a punch. Vanessa gripped the elevator railing, her vision swimming. A flag, a black mark that would follow her everywhere. A scarlet letter in an industry where reputation was everything. She'd heard of it happening to others, drunks, thieves, the reckless, but never her. Never the untouchable Vanessa Drummond. "You can't just," she started, but Rebecca's next words crushed her. "You're also barred from boarding any of our flights as a passenger," Rebecca said, her eyes flicking up from the screen. "Ever. Your belongings will be collected from the crew office, and then you're out." The elevator dinged again, and the doors slid open, revealing a stark hallway lined with frosted glass offices. Vanessa stumbled out, the officers guiding her toward a small room where a young supervisor waited, a folder in hand. His name was Ethan Voss, a nervous newbie she'd barely noticed before. Now he held her fate in his hands, his voice rehearsed as he slid the termination papers across the table. By signing this, you acknowledge your dismissal for conduct violations, including physical assault on a passenger, he said, avoiding her gaze. You waive any right to reinstatement or future employment with our affiliates. Vanessa stared at the papers, her hands shaking as she reached for the pen. Her mind screamed at her to fight, to argue, but what could she say? The video was out there, looping on that screen, spreading across phones and screens she couldn't stop. She signed, her signature a jagged scrawl, and Ethan took the folder back without a word. There's a changing room down the hall, he said. Leave your uniform and badge. The walk to the changing room was a blur. She passed crew members she'd once commanded, pilots who'd nodded at her orders, attendants who'd feared her temper. Now they averted their eyes, some with pity, others with satisfaction. Inside the locked room, she stripped off the blazer, the skirt, the name tag that had defined her for years. Her hands lingered on the badge. Vanessa Drummond, senior flight attendant, before she set it on the counter, her reflection in the mirror a stranger she didn't recognize. When she stepped out in plain clothes, her bag slung over her shoulder, Ethan took the uniform without comment. You're done here, he said, nodding to the officers. They escorted her back through the terminal, past the same passengers who'd watched her board with confidence hours ago. Now they pointed, whispered, laughed. That's the one from the video, a man said, loud enough for her to hear. Pushed the old lady, idiot. The sliding doors loomed ahead, and as they opened, the cold rush of outside air hit her like a slap. The officers stopped, releasing her without a word, and she stood there, alone on the curb. The airport towered behind her, a place she'd once ruled, now a fortress she'd never enter again. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her contacts, colleagues, friends, anyone who might help. She dialed her old supervisor, a woman who'd praised her work ethic. Come on, pick up, she muttered, but the line clicked to voicemail. She tried a Northrop pilot she'd trained with years ago. This number is unavailable, a robotic voice replied. One by one they shut her out, the industry's tight-knit web closing ranks against her. Her phone buzzed on a text from an unknown number. She opened it and her breath caught. A link to the video already viral with a caption, Flight Attendant Meltdown Career Over in 60 Seconds. Her hands shook as she watched it again, Maggie falling. The pearls scattering, her own stunned face staring back at her. Comments poured in below. What a psycho. Serves her right. Never flying that airline again. Vanessa's knees buckled, and she sank onto the curb, the phone slipping from her grasp. The taxis rolled by, the travelers rushed past. But she was invisible now, a nobody in a world she'd once owned. She'd lost her job, her badge, her respect, her future. And as the weight of it all crashed down, she realized the worst part. She'd lost herself. Edward Hensley hadn't just taken her career, erased her. And there was no coming back. The airport curb was cold beneath Vanessa Drummond, the concrete biting through her jeans as she sat there, motionless. The world spun on around her, taxis screeched to a stop, travelers dragged suitcases past in a hurry, a child's laughter echoed from somewhere near the pickup zone. Life kept moving, indifferent to the wreckage of hers. Her phone lay on the ground beside her, its screen dark now, but the sting of that viral video lingered like a bruise she couldn't touch. She'd lost everything, her job, her badge, her pride, her place in a world she'd once ruled with an iron grip. And yet, as the wind whipped through the terminal, cutting against her skin, she didn't feel anger. She felt empty. For years she'd walked these halls in her crisp navy uniform, her heels clicking with purpose, her voice commanding obedience. She'd looked down on passengers, on the loud ones, the late ones, the ones who dared question her, and she'd never doubted her right to do it. Seniority, experience, authority, they'd been her shield, her sword, her crown. She'd thought herself untouchable, a queen of the skies who could bend anyone to her will. But all it took was one moment, one reckless choice, to prove how fragile that crown really was. She thought back to Maggie Hensley, 74 years old, silver-haired, unassuming in her gray sweater and broken pearls. Vanessa had seen her and decided in an instant that she didn't belong. She judged her by her quiet demeanor, her simple elegance, and assumed she could push her aside. But Maggie hadn't fought back with shouts or threats. She'd sat there, calm and unshaken, And with one text, one silent act unraveled Vanessa's entire world. That was the real power Vanessa realized now. Not the loud, brash control she'd wielded, but the quiet strength that needed no words to destroy her. Edward Hensley had been the executioner. Yes, his voice over the intercom, his presence at the gate, his orders that turned her career to ash. But it was Maggie who'd lit the fuse. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded justice. She'd simply waited, her hazel eyes steady, her hands folded, and let the consequences unfold. Vanessa had mistaken that stillness for weakness, and it had cost her everything. She lifted her head, staring at the airport's glass facade. Her airport once, the place where she'd built her identity, where she'd thrived on control, now stood as a monument to her fall. She couldn't go back, couldn't board a plane, couldn't even call the people who'd once answered to her. The video was out there, spreading like wildfire across screens she'd never see, branding her a pariah in an industry that didn't forgive. Her savings would run out eventually, her name would fade into a cautionary tale. And then what? Who was she without the uniform, without the title, without the power she'd clung to so fiercely? A taxi pulled up, the driver leaning out with a gruff, "Need a ride?" Vanessa blinked, her throat tight, and shook her head. "No," she rasped, the word barely audible. He shrugged and drove off, leaving her alone again. She didn't know where to go, didn't know what came next. For the first time in years she had no schedule, no crew, no destination. She was just Vanessa, stripped bare, hollowed out, a nobody in a crowd of strangers. Across the terminal, Maggie Hensley stepped into a sleek black car, Edward at her side. She settled into the leather seat, her movements graceful, her hand still clutching that lone pearl. "A new necklace," she said softly, glancing at her husband with a faint smile. "Something simple this time." Edward nodded, his expression softening for her alone. "Anything you want," he replied, his voice a quiet promise. The car pulled away, disappearing into the flow of traffic, leaving the airport and Vanessa behind. Vanessa watched them go, a distant speck of black against the gray horizon, and something broke inside her. Not rage, not despair, but clarity. She'd spent her life believing power came from commanding others, from forcing them to bend. But Maggie had taught her otherwise. Real power was patience, silence, the ability to let your enemies bury themselves. Vanessa had been her own undoing, her arrogance, her temper, her need to dominate. And now, sitting on that curb with nothing left, she understood. No one was untouchable. Not when the strength you thought you had was built on sand. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and turned away from the airport. The wind carried the sound of jet engines fading into the sky, a sound she'd once loved, now a reminder of all she'd lost. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know who she'd become. But as she took her first step into the unknown, one truth settled deep in her bones. She'd never forget this. Not the fall, not the lesson, not the woman whose quiet had brought her to her knees. And somewhere in the hum of the world moving on, Maggie Hensley's silence echoed louder than Vanessa's screams ever could. And there you have it, Vanessa Drummond, once the queen of the skies, now just another cautionary tale sitting on an airport curb, wondering if Uber's hiring. It's almost poetic, isn't it? One minute you're telling people where to sit, the next you're Googling how to explain a viral meltdown to your mom. Meanwhile, Maggie Hensley's rolling off in a fancy car, probably picking out a new pearl necklace like it's just another Monday. Life's funny that way, it hands you a crown, then yanks it off when you least expect it. But let's bring this down to earth for a second. We've all got a little Vanessa in us, don't we? That moment when you're so sure you're right, maybe it's cutting in line at Starbucks because you're in a hurry, or snapping at the cashier who's moving too slow that you forget the world doesn't spin just for you. And in 2025, with cameras everywhere and TikTok ready to turn your bad day into a global roast, that arrogance can cost you more than a dirty look. Vanessa didn't just lose her job. She lost her whole identity because she couldn't see past her own nose. Maggie, though? She's proof you don't need to yell to win, you just need to know who's really holding the reins. So here's the lesson, served with a smirk. Next time you're tempted to flex your power, whether it's over a seat, a coffee order, or some poor soul on X who dared disagree with you, maybe take a breath. Check your pearls before you wreck yourself, because the quiet ones, they're the ones who'll have you trending for all the wrong reasons. Karma's got a Wi-Fi signal these days and it's fast. What do you think, folks? Have you ever had a Vanessa moment or maybe a Maggie one where you let someone else dig their own grave? Drop your stories in the comments, I'm dying to hear them. And hey, if you liked watching Vanessa crash and burn, or Maggie rise like a boss, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe and ring the bell. We've got more wild rides coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss the next one. Who knows? Maybe we'll find out if Vanessa's got a redemption arc or if she's still out there, banned from every plane and plotting her comeback on a Greyhound bus. See you in the skies or at least in the next story.